And I'm trying to begin by making the observation that issues of democracy and transformation have really been on the agenda for a much longer time. Most of you would remember the text, The Political Economy of Transition, which was published exactly 30 years ago. And I think one of its major issues that it grappled with were the issues of transformation, economic as well as political transformation. Of course, the term that we were using at that time was transition, being the transition from the colonial states to the post-colonial state, or what Igbo called the post-white settler state. And of course, Igbo was the editor of that particular collection. And I would further observe that there was a core of scholars around that time who were trying to grapple with these issues of how to deal with the state, the issue of class formation, the balance of forces within the country, and how industrialization, for example, could be the base of further, class formation and the associated struggles and the issue of social contracts connected with that. Of course, the key word at that point in time was transition. And of course, there's a sense in which transition and transformation are almost interchangeable. They all relate to the issue of change. We were trying to link the issue of the need for a national bourgeoisie, or the prospects of a national bourgeoisie being the anchor class in terms of economic transition. The national bourgeoisie in conjunction with the working class is playing a key role in that process. And we did not look at industrial transformation in isolation. We saw a link between that and land and agrarian reform, the imperative for that, the need for linkages between the two sectors. You could not have advancement in one of those sectors without progress in another. In other words, they were mutually intertwined. And of course, the issue of human resource development as, the basis for transformation. Of course, I began with the 80s when we were grappling with those particular issues. Things began to change in the 1990s in the economic arena, but also in the social arena. Most of you will remember ISAP, the Structural Adjustment Program, which was, I think, a seminal moment in the way economic policy was organized in this country. The kind of control that the state had in economic policy shifted to other agencies, the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. That program was very much informed by their intervention. It was very much informed by the sort of parameters that they did prescribe for Zimbabwe. And to some, that was a mistake. And some of us argued around that time that doing away with the national development project, doing away with national economic policy, and taking on structural adjustment was ceding control over levers of power, levers of the control of the economy. And I think the effects of ESOP were more or less immediate. You had social cuts, education and health. You had a very unplanned, haphazard trade liberalization, which destroyed some of the industries. Linkages between industry and agriculture were disrupted. And of course, you had, as a result of that, you had reaction. You had reaction from labor. It was reaction from other sections of the bourgeoisie. The social contract that had been put together in the 1980s was broken. You had an upsurge of protests in the mid-1990s. And the relationships between labor and the state certainly were weakened during that time. I know there were attempts at trying to resuscitate, the social contract in one way or another, but they did not succeed. And some of the longest strikes that you had was around 1996 and of course 1997 and so on. And issues regarding the constitution also, arose at that time. So you had a confluence, you had a coming together of economic protests, constitutional issues, explicitly political issues, and then you had the formation of the MDC towards the end of that decade, but also the NCA towards the end of that decade. I remember talking to one minister from a SADC state who remembers this period of structural adjustment and the consequences that it had for Zimbabwean politics. And, he was saying to me, he never understood, why a shrewd leader, like our leader at that time, could opt for ESOPs, knowing what the consequences would be. And our own economy around 1990 was in a fairly healthy state. It was in the top 5 in terms of industrialized economies on the continent were concerned. It had that economic base that it could have used, to have a viable national development project. But come to the end of the 1990s, you then have your polarization, which led to the formation of the MDC. And then 2000, of course, we all remember much more recent history, bitterly fought elections in 2002 also, in 2005, and then the deep economic crisis resulting in a severe contraction of the economy. Which all really then brings us to the topic the specific topic that we are looking at, and I keep on messing up the presentation in this way. Just to bring the account to the present, but before we go to the present, of course, 2008 was very important in that there was an attempt at that time at a political compromise, and then you had the GPA and the GNU, and later on, of course, 2013, you had the ZANU-PF landslide. But talking about this moment, I think one can isolate a number of elements that are important to take into account. One of them is, of course, that you have the challenge of factionalism in both the ruling party as well as opposition parties. And of course, factionalism, I think, is a symptom of underlying issues in those parties. And I think one of them clearly is the issue of lack of internal party democracy. It's missing. Or as I would put it, it's in intensive care. It's not perhaps even in the intensive care unit. It's really missing. There is no adherence to party constitutions and party procedures. Issues such as succession are not dealt with in relation to the rules and constitutions of the political parties themselves. Another element, of course, is that political patronage and clientelism. These are real challenges when it comes to elections. In the sense that you have vote buying on an extensive scale. And the forms that it takes we are all familiar with, including the use of state resources for the advantage of the party in power, whether it is the media, whether it is foreign aid, whether it is revenues from some of the sectors of the economy. It's so deep-seated now that elections have become a problem in themselves. And of course, the third element is that the crises remain, including the economic crisis. And its various manifestations are quite clear. Deindustrialization, problems with food security, balance of payments issues, and so on. And quite clearly also there is no coherence in the state's national development project. I think the last time that we had a national development plan could have been 25 years ago. And yet, if you look around our neighbors, those who are doing well, each one of them has a national development plan that looks holistically at the economy, at society, and then plans accordingly specifies an overall vision and sets specific targets. That is the immediate background in which we talk about the prospects of transformation. Which then brings me to the issue itself of reimagining democracy and transformation. And I think Tendai, Murisa and his colleagues have done a useful job in helping us unpack this. And because they've done it, I don't need to do it again, but I'll comment directly on their contribution, or specifically what they call the Democracy Manifesto, which is in the last section of the book. The manifesto begins with a critique of what it terms electoral or political democracy or liberal democracy. And I think one observation that Tendai makes is that democracy is equal to elections has been exported to Africa, and it has led to elite-based and unaccountable dynastic form of politics. And he goes on, to expand on that particular aspect. And he says, also democracy has been used as a shorthand for a certain form of political arrangements, which mostly include regular elections. And such thinking has led to narrow institutionalism without an organic evolution of democracy from the bottom. And in their view, this is defective democracy. The alternative is a democratization process that depends on an ecosystem of civil alliances, inclusive local government processes, social norms, and deliberative practices that have an organic rather than an institutional quality. And in its place, they argue we should have developmental democracy, a term that Thandika Mkandawire also uses. And proceeding from that critique, they then posit or identify 3 building blocks in their view that should constitute a democracy: citizenship, participation, and associational life. That not sufficient attention has been provided, has been devoted to these, and that it's time that we put our attention to them. But what about citizenship and participation? I think the manifesto is arguing that citizens should be at the center of the political process. People should insist on good governance on their own. They should be able to identify what the elements of good democratic governance are, and that there's need for a compact between organizations and the communities that they work with or that they do mobilize. In other words, the local roots of democracy are important to have, are important to support. Regarding participation, the manifesto says it should not be reduced to tokenism, as is often the case. Communities provided a template, and then the terms of participation themselves are set by those from outside. And then they conclude that there's need to reframe those relationships among its communities, professionals, and institutions in a participatory fashion, that each of those parties have a distinctive contribution to make in making participation, truly, a space, for them. And finally, the manifesto refers to associational life as another key block. And they begin by making the observation that there are many local associations in Zimbabwe. At the last count, about 3,000 in 2012, most likely, many more than those 3,000. And of course, we know the examples of those associations. Your residents associations, your professional associations, women's groups, youth groups, local development associations. In other words, there's a rich associational life in this country. But there's nothing really linking the experiences, the aspirations and experiences or visions of those various local associations. There is nothing linking them to a kind of a wider vision of democracy, a wider vision of transformation. They are sort of working in a kind of a silo approach. Each is doing their own thing. In other words, that rich associational life and experiences, in a sense, there is a waste to it, in the sense that it's not being tapped into, it's not linking it, it's not being linked into into a kind of a wider framework, a wider vision that speaks to all their various interests. In other words, there's no synergy between those associations. There's no distinctive role that they are playing in democracy as we understand it, or in wider transformation. They are, of course, involved in expression of local democracy, and that is important. But I think there is a need, for that local version of democracy to be linked to the wider national democracy. In other words, these building blocks These attributes could strengthen the discourse of democracy, but also the practice, the representativity of democracy in this country. Which then brings me to the final, more or less the final point. Which is really a kind of, a short, critique of the manifesto. I think also as a basis for the discussion in order to take the thinking around these things forward. My view is that the characterization of democracy in the manifesto tends to be dismissive. It's a dim view, on democracy, because I think voting is still very important. It was a hard-won right. I think it's too early, to dismiss one of the few channels of expression of preference, given that the electoral process itself remains imperfect, particularly here in Zimbabwe. A great deal remains to be done to make our electoral institutions and processes accountable and transparent. And I think if we view electoral democracy and developmental democracy as binaries, we're probably taking a myopic view, because I think both are really complementary. Electoral democracy and developmental democracy, they do enrich each other. And also, I suppose it relates to the issue of authoritarianism for development before democracy, or this idea that you cannot eat democracy. I think, in my view, that's a mistaken approach. Both aspects are important. You need development, but you also need democracy. Or in any case, it is the citizens themselves who really who should have the last say on this issue. The other observation that I do make is on the vehicles for the citizens and participation. The case for the two is compelling, and I do agree. But I think what's missing from the manifesto is a consideration of the vehicles for that participation and for that active citizenship, which should be the vehicle, organizational vehicles. There is no discussion about the potential role of movements or the potential role of parties, in giving expression or in mobilizing these citizens that we are talking about. There's also, I think, need to consider engagement with the state. You are not likely to have transformation without the state in one form or another. Some kind of access to the state or state power. I think there's need for some thinking around that area. And finally, of course, I think we need also to think even beyond the crisis and beyond the book. The classic question of what should be done and by whom, which the last session was beginning to discuss about. And in my view, it can even be more introspective in the sense that as the intelligentsia, as activists, as professionals, we need to think a bit more about what our role could be in this transformation process that we are all trying to push for. I'm not sure whether there can be an answer to that question, but I think it's on the table. And I think the manifesto also could take into account issues like strategic formulations, strategic issues. And of course, I'm reminded of by one activist who said transformation cannot be subcontracted. We have to be part of the process, but we can't do it on an individual basis or on the basis of an individual organization. And I think these are issues, that could enrich, if we think about them, could enrich this manifesto that I and others have kindly brought to our attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.